A subcontractor is an independent business that works for another organization as part of a larger project. When people talk of subcontractors, what frequently comes to mind is construction, retail services, and other activities of the legitimate sectors of our society. But this is not always the case. Today's episode examines the origin, the functioning, and the demise of Murder Incorporated, a criminal business organization that operated as specialized contract killers for the Italian-American Mafia, the Jewish mob, Irish gangs, and other American criminal organizations during the first half of the 20th century. In the course of its 12 years of existence, from 1929 to 1941, Murder Incorporated is alleged to have carried out at least 1,000 killings for criminal gangs and individual mob bosses throughout America. In the early 1920s, two teenage Jewish hoodlums, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, started a small racketeering operation to protect other Jewish schoolboys from Italian and Irish gangsters for a fee of 10 cents per head per week. As their customer base grew, Lansky brought in his younger brother Jacob Lansky and his childhood friends Meyer Wassel, Samuel Levine, Joseph Stocker, and Irving Sandler, all from the poverty-stricken Lower East Side of Manhattan. Around that time, another prominent teenage hoodlum called Lucky Luciano also ran a protection racket, extorting money from Jewish schoolboys. Mistaking Lansky for a shy Jewish youngster, Luciano tried to bully Lansky to pay him protection money. Lansky rained threats on Luciano and challenged him to a fight. This was very unlike other Jewish youngsters. The two became very close friends. But Luciano, being Italian, went ahead to pursue a criminal career in the Italian-American Mafia. The Lansky and Siegel gang grew a violent reputation for extorting money from Jewish, Irish, and Italian shopkeepers, moneylenders, and gambling house operators. The Protective Society, which became known as the Bugs and Meyer Mob, primarily operated protection rackets, but later leveraged Lansky's experience in automobiles to diversify into car theft and truck hijacking. During this time, alcohol production and distribution were prohibited in America, making the illegal supply of alcoholic beverages an insanely lucrative business for criminal gangs. They began supplying bootleggers with stolen trucks and alcohol shipments, and were often hired by New York mob bosses to accompany alcohol shipments and to hijack the consignments of rival crime bosses. Not able to dispose of all their loot, Lansky and Siegel opened a truck and car rental garage that served as a warehouse for stolen goods. Lansky was an astute criminal. He masterminded the most prolific operations and was considered the brain of the gang. In contrast, Bugsy, who was 4 years younger but short-tempered and ruthless, was considered the brawn. As their operations flourished, Lansky hired a group of expert hitmen, including Abner Zwillman, Mo Sedway, and Louis Buchalter, who acted as enforcers for their gang. Lansky began offering murder-for-hire services and carried out several contract killings for New York mob bosses, using his crew of specialist hitmen. After the American Mafia War in 1930 and 31, Salvatore Maranzano became the new leader of the Italian-American Mafia, and Lucky Luciano had become his second-in-command. Unfortunately, Maranzano treated his lieutenants harshly and felt threatened by Luciano's increasing popularity amongst the younger mobsters, who openly applauded Luciano's ideology of a modern mafia whereby Italians, Irish, and Jewish gangs would pool their resources and turn organized crime into a lucrative business for all. When Maranzano tried to kill Luciano, Luciano contacted Lansky. On September 10, 1931, Lansky dispatched 4 hitmen of the Bugs and Meyer gang, who invaded Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue in Manhattan and shot him dead. Luciano also used Lansky's men to eliminate Maranzano's closest allies, starting with the murder of Joseph Siragusa, the head of the Pittsburgh crime family, who was shot dead at his home, the disappearance of Joe Ardizzone, the head of the Los Angeles crime family, as well as 2 other of Maranzano's key allies, Samuel Monaco and Louis Russo, whose corpses were found in Newark Bay, New Jersey. With the death of Salvatore Maranzano, Lucky Luciano and his crew of young mobsters, known as the Young Turks, took over the control of mafia operations, starting with the creation of the National Crime Syndicate, which essentially brought all the mafia gangs in America, both Italian and non-Italian, under one umbrella. The idea of the syndicate was for all mafia groups to be fairly represented and for their representatives to be able to sit and deliberate issues, discuss strategy, settle disputes, and transform mafia operations into a lucrative business for all. It was therefore imperative to do things in an organized manner. In this regard, it was decided, amongst many other things, that the Bugs and Meyer gang, which had proven itself over time to be flawless in executing contract killings, would act as the official enforcers for all murders sanctioned by the National Crime Syndicate. Soon after, Siegel and Lansky disbanded the Bugs and Meyer gang and created Murder Incorporated. Unlike the previous gang, which was also involved in extortion and truck hijacking, Murder Inc. was primarily focused on contract killings. They accepted murder contracts from criminal gangs and mob bosses all around the United States. While some of the killers were on a regular salary, others operated on a fee-per-killing basis, with fees ranging from $1,000 to $5,000 per killing, depending on the profile of the target in question. If a killer was caught or convicted, Murder Inc. was committed to hiring the best lawyer for their defense, and their families would receive financial support from the mob. Murder Inc. was headed by Lansky's recruit Louis Buchalter, who was assisted by Albert Anastasia. Though Anastasia was the underboss of the Mangano crime family, hence a crime boss in his own right, he also acted as leader of Murder Inc.'s hit squad, for which he was referred to as the Lord High Executioner. Joe Adonis, who controlled bootlegging in Midtown Manhattan and was a close associate of Luciano's, acted as the liaison, giving Murder Inc. orders as decided by the syndicate's board of directors. In simple English, it was Joe Adonis who informed Murder Inc. about the syndicate's decision on who would die next, and when and how the person should be killed. Of the over 35 Murder Inc. hitmen, the most notorious were Louis Capone, Frankie Carbo, Louis Cohen, Irving Cohen, Philip Cohen, Samuel Levine, Harry Maione, Abe Relis, Jacob Shapiro, Harry Strauss, Aniello Della Croce, and Emmanuel Weiss. Harry Strauss was believed to be the organization's most prolific killer and is reported to have committed over 100 murders using a variety of methods, including stabbing, drowning, live burial, and strangulation. Strauss never carried a gun or any weapon in case the local police picked him up on suspicion. He would scout his murder spot for any tool that could do the job. As such, he was arrested 18 different times but was never convicted due to lack of evidence. Strauss was an exceptional talent in the killing game. On December 5, 1939, when he was ordered to murder Irving Feinstein, a labor racketeer and mobster, he simply subdued Feinstein and looped a rope around the victim's neck and feet, such that as Feinstein struggled, he slowly strangled himself. The death was slow and painful, but the crime scene was clean. Dutch Schultz's murder was the most renowned and probably the most investigated of the over 1,000 contract killings carried out by Murder Inc. In 1935, Dutch Schultz, a mob boss with a flourishing racketeering operation in the Bronx, was being investigated for federal tax evasion. When U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey finally indicted him, Schultz decided to assassinate Dewey. The matter was brought before the National Crime Syndicate. Luciano argued that the assassination of a prosecutor would trigger a heavy law enforcement crackdown on the mafia. Other members of the commission saw reason with Luciano, and Schultz was ordered to drop all plans of assassinating Dewey. Schultz was outraged and walked out of the meeting. Some days later, Schultz secretly contracted Murder Inc. to kill Dewey, but Albert Anastasia reported the information to the syndicate. The syndicate held a secret meeting, and after 6 hours of deliberation, it was decided that Schultz should be eliminated. Ironically, Murder Inc., which Schultz contracted to kill the prosecutor, was in turn hired to murder Schultz. Louis Buchalter, the head of Murder Inc., commissioned Emanuel Weiss and Charles Workman to carry out the killing. On October 24, 1935, the killers tracked down Schultz and 3 of his gang members at the Palace Chop House restaurant at 12th East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey. Weiss and Workman invaded the establishment from a back door and opened fire at Schultz, his chief lieutenant Abe Landau, his personal bodyguard Bernard Rosenkrantz, and his accountant Otto Berman. Berman, the gang accountant, collapsed immediately after he was shot. But Landau and Rosenkrantz, despite their injuries, rose to their feet, returned fire, and chased the hitmen out of the restaurant. Weiss jumped into a getaway car and escaped, while Workman made it back to Brooklyn on foot. Shortly after the shootout, Landau collapsed onto a nearby trash can, while Rosenkrantz went back into the restaurant, collected his change from the barman, called an ambulance, and then collapsed on the floor. All 3 of Schultz's associates died later that day, while Schultz clung to life and died the following day. The Abe Wagner contract was another well-publicized killing by Murder Inc. While the Mafia wasn't prepared to take the heat for killing a federal prosecutor, they didn't hesitate to eliminate any witnesses or suspected informants. This was the case for Abe Wagner, a Lower East Side bootlegger who informed on the crime syndicate to the police in July 1932. Earlier on February 20th, Wagner was riding down Suffolk Street in his brand new car when 6 shooters from the rival Mazza gang appeared out of nowhere and sprayed the vehicle with machine gun bullets. But Wagner managed to roll out the passenger's door and escape into the crowded street. When Wagner realized he could not overpower his adversaries, who were backed by the National Crime Syndicate, he turned police informant. After releasing detailed information about the existence and operations of the syndicate, Wagner then fled to St. Paul, Minnesota, changed his identity to Abe Loeb, and got into the fruit-selling business. But the syndicate, which had its eyes and ears on the ground throughout the country, soon learned of Wagner's whereabouts. Murder Inc. immediately dispatched 2 of their finest, George Young and Joseph Schaefer, to whack him. On July 25, 1932, Young and Schaefer followed Wagner as he was driving on University Avenue with his new partner Al Gordon after picking up medication from a drugstore. The hitmen suddenly opened fire and instantly killed Gordon. Wagner sped up and turned left into Snelling Avenue, where he jumped out of the car and ran towards the Green Dragon restaurant. The gunman caught up with him and shot him 6 times in front of witnesses. Other highly publicized contract killings included the murder of the mob boss Joseph Amberg, his brother Louis Amberg, and his bodyguard Morris Kessler. Throughout the 1930s, Murder Inc. leader Buchalter deployed his army of hitmen to murder rival mob bosses on behalf of the National Crime Syndicate. As Dewey's investigations into the Mafia intensified, witnesses and suspected informants became their frequent victims. In one case on May 11, 1937, 4 Murder Inc. hitmen hacked loan shark George Rudnick into pieces, stabbing him 54 times with an ice pick, on mere suspicion that he was a police informant. Even some of the organization's former hitmen suspected of collaborating with the police were not spared. In July 1937, the body of former Murder Inc. associate Walter Sage was tied to a slot machine and dumped into Swan Lake in Sullivan County, New York. Even Buchalter's protege, Max Rubin, was shot and severely wounded on October 1st. Rubin had disobeyed Buchalter's orders to leave town to avoid being summoned to testify against Buchalter. Note that the murder of Dutch Schultz was to prevent him from assassinating Thomas Dewey, a crusading prosecutor who was bent on shutting down all the rackets in New York and putting mobsters out of business. The National Crime Syndicate feared that the assassination of a federal prosecutor would result in a heavy crackdown on the Mafia. While this seemed logical, Dewey's relentless campaigns against mob activities would eventually result in the collapse of the syndicate and the downfall of Murder Inc. In February 1936, he created a task force of 160 police officers and raided over 200 brothels in Manhattan, arresting the prostitutes and forcing them to testify against racketeers. By June 1936, he had succeeded in convicting the top boss of the American Mafia and leader of the syndicate, Lucky Luciano, on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. Luciano was sentenced to 30 years in state prison. After Luciano's sentencing, power struggles within the Mafia resulted in the deaths and imprisonment of many prominent crime bosses and, eventually, the collapse of the syndicate. As investigations continued, several mobsters and Murder Inc. associates turned to police informants. They became material witnesses against the organization and its leaders for over 200 unresolved murder cases dating back to the early 1930s. In January 1940, career criminal Harry Rudolph came forward to testify in the murder of the 19-year-old gangster Alex Albert, who was shot dead in Brooklyn in November 1933. Though Rudolph himself was not a member of Murder Inc., his testimony resulted in the indictment of 3 Murder Inc. hitmen, Abe Reles, Martin Goldstein, and Anthony Maffiatore. While in detention, Rudolph was reportedly offered $5,000 by the syndicate to withdraw his testimony against Abe Reles and Martin Goldstein, as they were deemed very valuable to the organization. Upon hearing this, the neglected hitman Anthony Maffiatore also decided to cooperate, stating that he was the getaway driver in 6 contract killings. Unlike Rudolph, who was a regular criminal with some knowledge of the gang, Maffiatore provided first-hand insider information with specific details of how the murders were carried out. Seeing that things were getting out of hand, and for fear of the electric chair, Reles also agreed to testify. Reles turned out to have some kind of photographic memory of every single moment of his life. Being one of Murder Inc.'s chief hitmen, Reles' testimony covered specific details of every murder he had been involved in or heard of, including dates, times, locations, methods, weapons, participants, how the bodies were disposed of, and even what the weather was like. In fact, Reles' testimony was so detailed that fellow Murder Inc. member Harry Maione lost his temper and threw a glass of water at him during a trial session. Immediately, Reles started singing, and everything went down. Many mobsters fled from the city, while some hitmen rushed to the district attorney's office to cut deals, but the prosecutors already had an overwhelming amount of evidence against the mob. On March 27, 1940, Charles Workman, who was involved in the Dutch Schultz murder, was sentenced to life in prison but paroled in 1964 after serving 23 years. On April 27, 1940, Joe Adonis, who acted as liaison between the syndicate and Murder Inc., was indicted. Still, his case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Later that year, he moved with his family and settled in New Jersey. He was only indicted 12 years later and sentenced to 3 years in prison for illegal gambling, after which he was deported to his native Italy. On April 14, 1941, Harry Maione and Frank Abbandando were convicted of first-degree murder of George Rudnick. They were sentenced to death by the electric chair and were executed in February 1942. On April 24, 1941, Harry Strauss and Martin Goldstein were convicted for the murder of mobster Irving Feinstein and were sentenced to death by the electric chair. Strauss was the most prolific killer of the squad and had allegedly committed over 100 murders. He was executed on June 12, 1941. In the early morning of November 12, 1941, though in witness protection at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, with police guarding the door, Reles fell to his death from a 6th-floor window. It was highly speculated that Reles had been pushed out of the window, as his death came on the day he was to testify against Albert Anastasia, Murder Inc.'s Lord High Executioner. Reles' death came as a great relief to many mobsters against whom he had agreed to testify. Mob bosses dubbed Reles the canary that could sing but couldn't fly. The other witness, Anthony Maffiatore, remained in witness protection for a while, but a few years after completing his witness protection program, he vanished without a trace and was never heard from again. In June 1943, Murder Inc. leader Louis Buchalter and hitmen Emmanuel Weiss and Louis Capone were sentenced to death for the murder of candy store owner Joe Rosen. The 3 men were executed at the Sing Sing prison in March 1944. as criminal investigations continued to intensify, Murder Inc.'s Lord High Executioner, Albert Anastasia, joined the US Army and provided them contact information of key members of the Italian Mafia in preparation for the Allied invasion of Italy during the Second World War. Also, for most of his criminal career, Anastasia controlled New York City's waterfronts, including the dockworker unions. Therefore, he was in the unique position to watch out for German infiltrators during World War II, as German submarines were sinking Allied warships in great numbers along the docks in the New York harbor, where they were being built. Anastasia is believed to have joined the US Army to evade prosecution in connection with Murder Inc. In 1943, he was honorably discharged from military service and awarded US citizenship for his wartime contribution. Anastasia was never convicted in the Murder Inc. investigations. However, he was murdered 14 years later in connection with a feud between Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese over the control of the Luciano crime family. In September 1941, Bugsy Siegel, co-founder of Murder Inc., was put on trial for the murder of Harry Greenberg, a low-profile employee of the mob. Siegel's trial received a lot of media attention because he received preferential treatment from prison authorities. His chefs brought him delicacies so he didn't have to eat prison food. He was allowed conjugal visits from numerous women and was frequently granted leave for dental appointments. Before the end of his trial, the two key witnesses against him vanished and were never heard from again. Consequently, he was acquitted for lack of evidence. In June 1947, some 6 years later, Siegel was shot dead in his Beverly Hills mansion by an unknown gunman. Till today, the crime remains unresolved, and nobody was ever charged. Finally, Meyer Lansky, the brains of the Lansky and Siegel gang and co-founder of Murder Inc., was never convicted in connection with the organization's operations or any serious mafia-related offenses. The testimonies of convicted hitmen and mobsters could never implicate him, since he mostly controlled Murder Inc. and other mafia activities from the shadows. Lansky is undoubtedly the most influential non-Italian in the history of the Italian-American Mafia. Organized crime scholars believe Lansky to be the most accomplished gangster in American history because he never had a significant conviction despite nearly 50 years of active involvement in the mafia. Even after the death, imprisonment, and disappearance of nearly all his contemporaries, Lansky continued to grow his criminal empire, laundered his money through legitimate businesses, and eventually retired from gang life. He lived his last days quietly at his beach home in Miami, Florida, and died of natural causes at age 80, leaving behind a widow and 3 children. Lansky has been described as the brains, the secret mover, the invisible hand, the inspirer, and the controller of American organized crime. His life story and contributions in the reformation of the American Mafia will be covered in a separate video. Thank you for watching. If you have a video idea, why not leave a comment below? And if we make it, we'll give you a big shout out. And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more videos on crime stories, notorious outlaws, and historical scandals.